My name is Blue Baldwin, and I work for the City of Tucson, situated in the water department, which is part of the city. It's about equivalent to your water corporation. It delivers water. It does not deal with wastewater, however, so some differences there. And today I'm going to talk about a program that is new to the City of Tucson that is all about harnessing the power of stormwater as an irrigation resource for urban greening projects throughout the City of Tucson. And that program is called Storm to Shade. Let's see. So just to situate us, we are in Tucson, Arizona, which is in the Sonoran Desert. It's an absolutely beautiful place, with saguaro cacti being that sort of iconic desert species that most of you probably recognize in the foreground. The Sonoran Desert is the most biodiverse desert in the world, so similar to this region, we're an incredible biodiversity hotspot, and our plants and animals are really have astounding evolutionary mechanisms for dealing with extreme climate, from very, very hot temperatures in the summer to really, really chilly temperatures in the wintertime. We are not on an ocean, so we don't have temperate, we have extremes. We get approximately 300 millimeters of rainfall a year. That's actually high because it's been decreasing over the past couple of years. And so I think our average over the last 10 is less than that. So you all think you're dry. We're really dry. We also have had over 100 days of 43-degree temperatures just this year. And our temperatures now in fall on our side of the world are just beginning to drop below the 100s. I just spoke to my daughter this morning. It was her afternoon. She said, finally, it's getting cool enough to go outside in the morning and have some lovely outdoor time. And our soil, I realize this is a really interesting component that I actually hadn't thought much about until coming over here and speaking to you all, because you have these incredibly sandy soils that percolate and infiltrate water very, very rapidly. And that seems to be a really lively conversation over on this side. Our soils vary greatly from one part of the city to the other, from the base of the mountains down into the valleys. We have a lot of sandy, gravelly soil, but we also have in some areas a lot of clay. And then we also have what we call caliche, which is approximate to your limestone shelves. And so when we are doing projects, often we will do percolation tests beforehand to see what the drainage is like in that particular zone, because it can vary in really close proximity from one spot to another. This is a graphic that shows Tucson Water's resources, and it's interesting to note where we have been and where we are going. So starting in about the 1940s was when Tucson became an actual city. A lot of folks started moving to Tucson from the East Coast and the Midwestern United States primarily. And so you see the population, which is, or not the population, but rather the groundwater resource, which is that dark blue block, increasingly used. And that was our primary water resource up until about 1990. We were the last city in the US to subsist entirely on groundwater, or not last, but we did it the longest. And then in the 90s, Colorado River water was introduced via a project called the Central Arizona Project, which pumps water in an open canal all the way from the Colorado River to Tucson. This is an extremely energy-intensive process, and it takes the most energy of any other single project in all of Arizona. So we introduced Colorado River water. We also started diversifying by using a lot of reclaimed and remediated groundwater. And then right up at the top, near the end of the graph, you see this thin little green line, which represents stormwater. And that coincides with the time in Tucson Water's history when we adopted what's called a one water philosophy, which basically means all water resources can be managed for benefit. And so we began to see stormwater as a resource that we could actually manage. Our water conservation efforts, similar to yours, have been extremely successful. So the red line on this graph represents population, and it has grown steadily over the years. The Tucson metro area is approximately 1,000 people at this point, or I'm sorry, 1 million people at this point. But you can see our potable and reclaimed resources, our potable water, and residential consumption has decreased steadily over years. And this is due to a really strong conservation program that's headed up by Tucson Water, the water utility, which has been delivering really strong messages about conservation for decades. Something I noticed somebody say here was, if you grew up in Perth, you grew up turning off the faucet when you brush your teeth, and everybody does that. It's just a cultural thing. It's the very same for us. We know to turn off that faucet when we brush our teeth. You all have a lot more water sense appliances, I've noticed, which is something that's relatively new for us. But the Tucson Water Utility does offer rebates when folks switch out old appliances for new water sense appliances. Tucson Water also offers rebates to people for installing rainwater harvesting cisterns or water tanks on their property, as well as for digging shallow rainwater harvesting basins on their property. And so when folks do that, they can show how much capacity they've added in terms of either tanks or basins, and they get $1 or 50% or 50 cents back per gallon. So why GSI? Why Green Stormwater Infrastructure? Well, even though we've been doing this amazing job of conserving water in Tucson, we still are in a desert, and we are in a tier 2 drought as of last year, which means significant cuts to irrigation have been made. And we're seeing our rainfall decrease. So we know that no matter what, we still need to try to minimize our water usage. And so primarily our driver is to offset demand on potable and reclaimed water for irrigation. So we know that, like you, that though folks are doing a great job of conserving water in their homes, a lot of water that is consumed is going into folks' gardens and backyards and landscapes. We also want to mitigate urban heat island effect. So as I mentioned, just this past year, we've had over 100 degrees or over 100 days of 43 plus degrees. And so heat is a really significant public health concern. And so we are looking for all sorts of different tools and mechanisms that we can employ to mitigate urban heat. We also know that GSI provides all these wonderful ecosystem services like improved air quality and water quality and increasing soil health. And we know that soil health is extremely important because soil health is the basis of our plant health. We also know that healthy soil sequesters carbon, and so there's another tool there. Improved health and well-being. We know that access to green space, nature, vegetation is just good for us humans because we're part of nature, as much as we like to forget it. We also are aiming to create habitat and support biodiversity in the urban environment. We are nature lovers like you and really proud of our local flora and fauna. And so we want to invite those things into our urban habitats. We also want to increase access to green space and recreational activities. When there's no shade and it's so hot, folks are a lot less likely to want to get outdoors and will just sit in their air-conditioned homes. And so the shadier and the cooler the environment we can provide, the more we'll get people outside enjoying nature and being active. And then just overall climate resilience is what we're shooting for. And because we are responsible desert dwellers, and this is a campaign of Tucson Waters that's all about when you live in a desert, all of the things you can do to be a responsible desert dweller. I want to situate us in time here with this slide, just to show that this program, the Storm to Shade program, has been supported and moved along by many actions over the last couple of decades. Our indigenous populations were incredible water managers and used canal systems to support irrigation. They understood the seasonal rainfall, and they were really masterful at utilizing those resources to support their populations. In the modern era, we have had a lot of community and grassroots actions that have led us to where we are today. So a lot of action on the part of the University of Arizona in Tucson, with classes being taught around harvesting stormwater for beneficial use. And then in the early 2000s, a fellow named Brad Lancaster, this is a picture of his book, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond, that I highly recommend to anybody who's interested in rainwater harvesting. It's an incredible, very accessible how-to guide for rainwater harvesting, really pointing out that all of these things that we do to collect rainwater off of our streets are pretty low tech and very accessible to folks. So in the early 2000s, Brad just started cutting the curbs in his neighborhood. Before it was legal, it was illegal, but he calls it pre-legal. And behind those curbs, digging shallow basins. So really just creating an opening in the curb to grab water off of the street during a rain and put it into the ground outside of his home. And in those basins, planting vegetation. And in this way, he transformed a really hot, barren, and dry neighborhood into what is now one of the greenest neighborhoods in all of Tucson, and is truly a pilot and a demonstration site for the work that this city program is doing. And over time, the city and the county watched and started catching on, and began to pass ordinances that actually required rainwater harvesting methods. In 2010, you'll see below in white writing, it says Mayor and Council adopt commercial rainwater harvesting ordinance. The commercial rainwater harvesting ordinance required that for all new commercial businesses, a minimum of 50% of irrigation required water be met by harvested resources. So basically, when you're designing your new commercial business, just slope your parking lot slightly toward where you plan to have your trees and your vegetation. So really, really simple. Unfortunately, because of really just funding and staffing issues at the city, this ordinance is not well enforced. And so these days, even though this ordinance is on the books, we don't see a lot of this unless the developers and contractors are already aware of it. But there have been lots of efforts, and then we see a lot of plans, a lot of networking groups going forward, creating sustainability, livability, resilience plans for the city of Tucson. And then all the way at the end, you see that Mayor and Council create the GSI program for the city of Tucson, and that's where I hop into this picture. And so in 2019, the mayor and the council, which are very powerful in Tucson, there's a mayor and then 6 council members, decided that they wanted to add a fee on folks' water utility bills. So this fee is 13 cents on the cubic foot of water consumed. And that is ending up to be around 91 cents a month per customer. So very small fee for anyone inside the city, both residential and commercial. This is non-regulatory, i.e. a voluntary program, meaning that we are not doing green stormwater infrastructure projects in order to comply with any regulations from the state around water quality. We have a separate stormwater and sewer system. And so in many places in the US where there are separate stormwaters and sewers, there is a permit that is required that's all about complying with certain standards for stormwater quality. That is not why we're doing what we're doing. It's just a lovely co-benefit, really. We build projects on public or city-owned property only, so I'm not going to be talking about anything on private property. In 2021, I and my staff were hired. I have a capital projects manager who sees all of our projects from concept through construction. We have a maintenance program manager who manages our maintenance program, and we have a public outreach coordinator who's really the face of the program and the one who goes out and meets with the community to share information about what we're doing and listen to folks' concerns. And we started the pilot program, but in 2023, we were made permanent. So we shall live on. So the basic components of the program are, as I mentioned, a capital program to build new GSI, a maintenance program to maintain anything that we build, as well as a lot of GSI that's been built through various city programs over the last couple of decades. And then we're doing all of this with a focus on equity, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So just so we're all on the same page, the basic building blocks of GSI are inlets, as you can see top left. So basically either cutting curb or creating flush curbs so that water can flow into the landscape. And then basins, as we see in top right, that collect the water. Quick note, we're required to make sure that that water is infiltrating in 48 hours or less. Bottom left is soil. We understand that soil is extremely important for the health of our plants and vegetation, and also that's carbon sequestration action that it can perform. And then vegetation is really at the heart of what we're doing. We are again trying to grow vegetation, grow shade, grow habitat. This is a map of the tool that we use to prioritize our investments, both in our capital projects and in our maintenance program. It's called the Tree Equity Score, and we did not invent it. We borrowed it from an organization called American Forests, and it's very, very handy in that it mashes up GIS data layers based on census data tracks, and it smushes together both socio-demographic indicators and environmental indicators of vulnerability. So it includes existing tree canopy percentage, population density, surface temperature, race, income, employment, age, and health. And as you can see, we've overlaid this upon the city of Tucson. You know what, give me 1 second. I got some really cute kids playing outside, but I'm super distracted by them. I'll be right back. Thank you. So when we lay tree equity score over the city of Tucson, it becomes really easy to see where folks in Tucson are more well off, and also where there is more vegetation and tree canopy cover. So it's not surprising to see that there are concentrated areas of green and dark green, and then a lot of surrounded areas that have a very low tree equity score, meaning where populations are more vulnerable and there's less green space. This seems to be not exactly the case here, I'm noticing. From what I understand, tree canopy doesn't seem to be very directly connected to wealth disparities, which is an interesting thing. But in Tucson, it certainly is. Where more low-income people live, there's also markedly less green space and vegetation. So our capital process, how we identify new projects. First and foremost, we're leveraging funding with existing City of Tucson improvement projects. So several bond packages have been passed over the past few years that are improving our parks and our roadways and adding things like bicycle lanes, pedestrian safety, urban greenways. And so we work closely with our colleagues in other city departments like Parks and Recreation and Transportation Mobility, who are running those projects to see, are there opportunities to add GSI into those existing projects, and in that way we can stretch our dollars. We also work really closely with those 6 ward offices. So as I mentioned, we have a mayor, and then we have 6 city council members, each with their own ward. And those are the people really on the ground. They know their populations best, they know their communities best, and so they provide us with input around where they would like to see more green space added. And then we use that tool that was the last slide about tree equity score so that we can look within each ward and identify those spots where green space is needed the most. So I'm going to run us through a project as an example. This was the very first project that we got in the ground. It was just completed in June, and it was part of a big bond package to improve a park that included things like new lighting, new fields, a splash pad, which is basically a water play area for kids, a new parking lot, a whole bunch of improvements in a really well-used park in a really historically underserved part of town. The park is just adjacent to a high school and in the middle of many residential areas. So it was a wonderful candidate for some great improvement. So we have added vegetated basins, bioswales, curb scuppers, native trees, about 48 of them, and shrubs to an area in this park that was previously just sort of dying, scrubby Bermuda grass that was on irrigation but wasn't being used for anything or any benefit. And we have been able to transform this area into this beautiful natural space. Unfortunately, these pictures were taken really shortly after planting. So the trees and the vegetation still look really immature, but it's really grown and greened out since. So this is just to give you an idea. If you start at the schematic top left, you'll see number 1, number 2, and number 3, and then those are reflected in the photos to the right. So number 1 shows the biggest vegetated swale that we added. So pulling water off of that adjacent street into a long swale along the side of that field. Number 2 is parking lot features that became GSI. So this was not originally in the scope of our project, but the landscape architect that we were working with, who was also the landscape architect for the rest of the park, got really excited when he saw that we were doing GSI in this park. And he asked if he could add GSI in other areas of the park that we didn't even have eyes on at that point. And we said, yes, absolutely, please do. And so he did. And so we ended up with this wonderful rainwater harvesting parking lot as well. And then the third was another area that we had not initially identified, but that was added because we saw additional opportunity to invigorate a space that was really just a patch of dirt. In the bottom left, I just wanted to include a standard detail because we have standard details for all of these things. So if you're interested, they are published on our Storm to Shade website, and they have all sorts of details in there, everything from a basin bottom to a curb cut to a scupper that conveys water underneath the sidewalk. So this is how it works. Keep your eyes on the blue arrows. They're coming from a big road, and I mean a big road. I haven't seen one quite as big so far in Perth, but trust me, it's a lot of square footage. So when water falls onto this road, it goes to the edges of the street, and we've punched some holes through that sidewalk to allow water to convey into these basins that we've dug out and added a lot of vegetation to. And then once the capacity of those is exceeded, there's a designed overflow through a perforated pipe into an adjacent wash. All right, now we're switching gears into our maintenance program. This photo is of a project that we did not build, but that our county flood control district built. And they are the ones who are charged with managing big storm events. So our scale is significantly smaller. Flood mitigation is not one of our primary drivers. We can mitigate some minor flooding, but not major flooding. But Flood Control District does flood mitigation. They were really disincentivized to build projects within the city because they simply did not have the logistical operational capacity to do maintenance to the projects that they built within the city. And so when the Storm to Shade program came into existence, we recognized that there could be this collaboration where if the flood control district invested in projects inside of the city, which is really helpful to folks living in the city, then we could take on the maintenance of those projects. And whereas before the flood control district tended to build projects that were more like just big retention or detention basins, we asked that they add lots and lots of vegetation to get those additional benefits as well. And they're willing to do that because they don't have to maintain them, we do. So our deal with them is we maintain the vegetation in these larger projects. They maintain any structural elements. So from time to time, if we have to do a sediment removal to restore some capacity, that's their job. So maintenance, as far from everyone I've ever spoken to in any other city, we all recognize that maintenance is a huge challenge. It's just tricky, and it tends to be an afterthought. Nobody really likes to think about it. It's not the shiny, glimmering, brand new project that we all love. It's just something that has to be done. But we were well aware of this when we formed this program, and we have a dedicated maintenance budget. And so we dove in. Some of the challenges we immediately recognized were that the Green Stormwater Infrastructure assets that existed in the city of Tucson belonged under different departments' jurisdictions. So this one in the photo, for instance, is maintained or had been maintained. And when I say maintained, I mean really only in a responsive way, if there were a problem with it, by our Department of Transportation and Mobility. Our Department of Transportation and Mobility deals with everything concerning roads throughout the city of Tucson. So it's a huge beast of a department, and landscape and vegetation is not their forte. They don't have the funding to invest much in it. They don't have the funding to invest much in their staff to know how to deal with it properly. And so when something would happen, say this tree got blown over in a storm, or maybe just a branch of it got hit by a truck passing by, their response is, oh, send out a streets maintenance crew member with a chainsaw and fix the problem. And then that guy would show up and wield his chainsaw, and then the next thing you know, we have 10 residents from that neighborhood calling up and saying, oh, the city, you messed up again, you butchered my tree in my neighborhood, and everybody was unhappy. This happened so regularly, in fact, that a Facebook page was started by an anonymous resident called Tucson Hates Trees, which is a place for folks to vent their frustration with the city and how poorly it cares for our trees. And so we knew something needed to be done about this. Also, these departments have different asset management systems that don't communicate with one another. So between Parks and Recreation that has GSI, Transportation Mobility that has GSI, Environmental Services that has GSI, none of these systems interact with one another. Everyone is siloed. Nobody knows who's on first. And then there's a matter of competing interests and some protocols. So there's a lot of GSI that exists on Tucson water inactive well sites, which tend to be just dirt lots plunked in the middle of neighborhoods. And so residents would get these great ideas. Hey, let's build some GSI on this. Let's enliven the space, add some vegetation. And they would go ahead and do that. But then sometimes the Tucson Water Utility would need to access that space and activate it and use that well again. And they would come in to find all of these mature trees planted everywhere and no access to their equipment. And so that always ended negatively. And then another thing is we have a really, really massive shelterless, homeless population in Tucson right now. And vegetation and shade are needed by everyone, especially our most vulnerable. And so when we're planting trees and vegetation, we know that folks are going to take advantage of that as a resource, as a safe place to be to escape our 43-degree plus temperatures. And so this becomes somewhat of a push and pull with knowing we need to provide these resources, but also with folks not wanting to attract those populations to their neighborhoods. Shelly, can you hear that machine? Just give me a nod. Okay, great. Then finally, maintenance contractors and city staff. As I mentioned before, our city staff and a lot of maintenance contractors that work for the city do not have a lot of education. Nobody's invested in them with real skills. There's really high turnover in those jobs. They're minimum wage jobs. Our minimum wage is not what it is here. It's much lower. It is not a livable wage, unfortunately. And so we see a lot of turnover in those departments, and therefore a lack of interest in investing in those folks to give them the tools that they need to really know how to properly take care of our native landscapes. Fortunately, their help was on the way. Right as our program launched, the timing was just perfect, and the University of Arizona approached us with a grant opportunity to develop a maintenance protocol that could be adopted across the city of Tucson. And so that was a really wonderful, inclusive process where we reached out to everyone that has their hands in this space at all and invited them into this conversation about how are we really going to maintain our GSI. We talked about all sorts of things to get to the hardest, trickiest questions, such as what's the difference between a weed and a wildflower? You know, you can have two people looking at the same landscape. One of them thinks it's a beautiful, natural, native desert landscape. The other thinks it looks like a field of weeds and needs to be mowed down. And so we really got to the heart of those tricky conversations. Answer, in our case, being it's all about the health of the landscape and human safety. So if the plants are healthy, if they're thriving, if they don't pose a threat, a fire threat or a noxious threat, then we leave them. So taking aesthetic preferences out of the conversation. We created 4 maintenance training protocols, which we delivered online. This was the middle of COVID 2021. So a lot online, but then also followed up with field days. We penned agreements with other city departments, such as the Transportation, Mobility, and Parks and Recreation, to really clearly point out who is responsible for what, when, where, and outline our processes. And finally, we created an asset management system. This is a system that is truly designed for Tucson Water's nuts and bolts, pipes, valves, pumps, but we managed to shove inlets, outlets, sediment traps, and vegetation into it. And so we have this incredibly powerful system that is entirely automated and that we're going to be able to pull really, really awesome data out of. So some milestones. We trained 230 people, 90 of whom were city staff, and those trainings are ongoing, and we were offering them quarterly. We published our pocket guide, which is a handy dandy, oh, I've got it right here actually, handy dandy little guide. It's waterproof. You can run over it with your car, you can spill your coffee on it, you can take it everywhere you go. We hired 6 local maintenance contractors. So this was huge because we did not want our existing city staff to have to take on the bear's portion of the maintenance. So we were able to reach out into the community that has a long history of doing rainwater harvesting in GSI and identify those experts in the field and hire them, which has been amazing. Most of them are very small outfits, 2 to 3 people, and we've seen them scale. So we've created jobs and we've created real livelihoods for some really small contractors, which is very exciting. We executed those MOUs with other departments. We created a prioritization system for how we're going to maintain all of our assets. There are 700 plus assets throughout the city of Tucson. We don't have the capacity to do them all. We don't have the maintenance or the funding to do them all. And so we have created a tiered system for addressing maintenance as we're able, with certain sites prioritized and others taking second and third priority. We also did an asset inventory. Prior to the existence of this program, there was all this GSI out there, but nobody really knew exactly where it was. And now we have geolocated all of it. And we launched our asset management system last week. Hooray. This is a little sneak peek of that same pocket guide, showing a couple of interesting pages. So sort of the structural elements, the basics of GSI so that folks out in the field can identify it when they see it. Typical tools, notably absent are things like lawnmowers, chainsaws, pole saws, anything electronic, because we really want gentle. Maintenance is gentle. We have some information about soil and building soil, things like leave the leaves because the leaves are the basis of the soil. when a tree drops its leaves, that becomes future nutrients for that soil. And then our greatest offenders in the weeds department, things like buffalo grass, which are highly flammable, and toxic stink net, which is both flammable and when it burns creates a toxic and corrosive gas that's poisonous to breathe. Lovely one. It's bad. All right, switching gears. We're going to start talking about the equity piece of the program now. The equigenic effect is this wonderful, magical, and not necessarily intuitive phenomenon that basically says, and I'm just going to use an example because I think it's the easiest way. If you have two kids, one is a middle-class white kid, the other is a low-income minority kid. You give them both access to natural green space, which we know is good for both of them, right? Of course. The one that will actually benefit more is the one that started out with less advantage. So an equigenic effect means that the long-term health outcomes of the kid who started out with less access to green space, lower socioeconomic status, poorer health outcomes will actually benefit more than this other kid that was already doing all right. So this really is a motivating factor for us in terms of adding GSI and green space where populations need it most. We know what our social determinants of health are. We know what those things are that give people poor health outcomes and better health outcomes. Things like education, economic stability, social and community factors, access to healthcare, and then the built environment. And in our program, we can't do much about any of these except for the built environment, over which we do have some really awesome power. And so what we're looking to do is to change the environment that people are walking out their front doors and experiencing every day to hopefully boost their outcomes and their quality of life and well-being. The photo here is a very typical Tucson streetscape. This is representative of all of the big boulevards and avenues of Tucson. Not a lot of trees, not a lot of shade. This lady is sitting at a bus stop that has no overhead shelter. She's found a spot of shade behind a sign, but certainly she walked where she is, and imagine this is one of those 43-degree+ days. It's hot, it's brutal. And so what we're trying to do is give this lady a cooler, shadier, more beautiful environment to live in. So going back to that tree equity score map, our funding is divided equally for our capital program across the 6 wards of the city that I've referred to a couple of times. And so we have this big pot of money, and it's divided in 7 slices, 1 for each of our 6 wards, and then the mayor has her own equal allocation as well to use at her discretion. Now, when you look at this, you can see that Ward 6 has a lot of already very green space in it, whereas Ward 5, bottom left, so our southern and southwestern portion of the city, has none. And so this is an issue. This is a problem. It gets worse. Once we performed our asset inventory, we found that 50% of all existing green stormwater infrastructure assets in the city of Tucson are located in 1 ward, and that is that Ward 6, where you see the green background, and then all of those little dots represent a form of GSI, whether it's a traffic circle or a chicane or GSI existing in parks. And then you see the rest is kind of sprinkled into 2 of the other wards, and then a couple of the wards have very, very little. So this is where our existing GSI is. Now, okay, I'm going to flip back real quick. Keep an eye on that pie chart. That's where assets are located. This is where we spent money maintaining those assets. So investment is compounding investment. And because Ward 6 already has so many assets, we had to spend half of our funding for our maintenance on maintaining those assets. And so the people living in those neighborhoods not only are already living in greener, healthier communities, but we are investing as the city in those same communities twice over. Now we're sending our maintenance workers in there. They're representing the city of Tucson. That provides increased access to the channels of government for those same populations. Meanwhile, in the rest of the wards, it's far less. So the way that we are presently structured in reality is far left reality, where some of our wards have this wonderful access to GSI, and it has improved these neighborhoods and communities. We're trying to be equitable, but we're not there, given that when we invest in communities, we are just adding another block and another block and another block because our funding is tied to each ward office. So one of our big challenges that we're working on now is how do we go back to our mayor and council with a proposal to untether our funding for capital projects to each ward and be able to invest more in the wards where there's less GSI so that we can strive for becoming what we see in equity. But we're not there yet. And then finally, to wrap up, this is an animation that was made for us by a local Tucson artist named Alex Jimenez. And we use it in our education and outreach to show people what GSI is and how it works, because a picture is worth 1,000 words and an animation is worth thousands of words. Also, I'm not sure the sound is going to work, but here it goes. We'll try. Sally, were you able to hear that?
No, we didn't hear.
Bummer.
Which is a shame, but
oh well.
It looked really good though.
Okay, cool. And that's
it. That's amazing, Blue. Thank you so much. So that's yeah, I love the presentation. I've been lucky. I saw it yesterday too, so that's awesome. I still have lots of questions, but we do have some questions in the chat. Blue, would you mind not sharing your screen anymore, and then we can get everybody up? And please feel free, people, to I'm going to gallery view now. There we go. So thank you again, Blue, for that amazing presentation about how you are able to deliver green stormwater infrastructure in a place that gets less rainfall than we do. And of course, so that's a couple of the questions that are in the chat about, oops, let's see if I can make that work better. The first one was from Riley. Does planting in the city help with the urban heat? Because it is a desert climate, would there be limited species that are available to use? Oh, thank you, Michael, for turning on your camera. That's awesome. And everybody else, feel free to as well. Blue, what do you think about planting in urban heat?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. I love this question. Yes, there are so many desert species that are that thrive in our desert environment. So to name a couple, we have a lot of mesquite. We have something called the palo verde. This is the one that's on here. It's got green bark. Palo means stick, verde means green in Spanish. So really hardy, successful trees. We've got acacia. Our acacia don't look anything like yours, but we have a wide variety of acacia as well. And then just bushels and bushels of shrubs, a lot of native grasses, and all of these things thrive in the desert environment despite our extremes in climate. So yeah, absolutely. And urban heat island mitigation is our massive driver.
Definitely, that's fantastic. I'll just ask Beck's question, and then Riley, if you want to ask your next question. So the vegetation irrigation. So as we have over here, sometimes we can go 4 or 5 months without rain, and so the conversation is, well, how do you irrigate that vegetation in summer? How does yours thrive throughout the whole year?
Yeah, so our biggest challenge is in establishment. So when we build a new project and we plant bushels of trees and vegetation, it's really just getting it going. So one thing that we try to do is to plant in the fall or early winter, so to give kind of a gentle landing to all of that vegetation, not the scorching temperatures. But we do use irrigation reticulation systems in the majority of our new projects for landscape establishments, with the goal that after the landscape is established, we will not have to use that irrigation anymore. It is nice, given that we are in a drought and we're seeing drier and drier summers, that we have that option of turning on the irrigation if plants go into, SOS mode. But typically we're planting with the hopes of being able to shut off those irrigation systems and that those plants can subsist on harvested stormwater alone. Again, they're native plants. They've evolved over millennia in this extreme climate. And so most of them can survive once they're established on rain alone.
Fantastic. Thanks, Blue. And the next question is from Riley, who you can see there. Riley, did you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, my question was just about the filtration. How effective is that, just in terms of a natural sense? There was an add-on to my question as well about just takeaway containers and other pollution. So how effective is the natural filtration off the stormwater coming off the road? Because there obviously is a lot more people and cars in that area.
Sure. Yeah. So in something that I've learned over time is that in most of the US, GSI is used to comply with that permit that I spoke about earlier, the separate municipal stormwater sewer system permit that says thou shalt maintain a water quality of X as far as the various contaminants. So cities like Philadelphia, which is a really, really old city on the East Coast, it's at the confluence of 2 different big rivers, are pioneers in using GSI for water quality purposes, catching that stormwater after it falls off of the city, runs down those filthy, filthy streets before it hits the rivers. So those rivers were considered dead rivers back in, I think, the 50s and 60s. But with the addition of a lot of really large scale green infrastructure, they've brought those rivers back to life. And so we're working on a much smaller scale. And again, our driver is not water quality, but GSI does perform that benefit. And so healthy soil, a lot of different plants and plant roots, particularly grasses, are super duper effective in filtering out toxins. But that being said, the water that we're putting into our features is not making it down to our groundwater. Our aquifers are super duper deep. So really, we're just putting water in local soil. Did that answer your question, Riley?
Yeah. Do you find that the kind of the buildup of pollution is quite bad, considering you go a fair while without getting any rainfall to wash that pollution off?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, you can sometimes some of our GSI that has rocks, like if we're using rock to line a wall, you'll see, sort of this black layer. But as far as the soil itself, no. And we're doing some analysis, just starting to do some soil analysis in GSI. In fact, that has only come with this study that I'm in Australia right now visiting the UWA, because we have a collaboration between the University of Arizona and UWA that's all about urban greening projects and community preferences around what they see in the urban environments in greening. But we do have this physical sciences component where we're beginning to look at soil quality within GSI structures compared to outside of GSI structures. And what we see is significantly more organic material, more moisture content, all those things that are fairly intuitive inside of GSI basins. As far as testing for toxins, we have not done that yet. But what I know is it is beneficial to put the stormwater runoff into these systems with all of these plants, and there is that natural filtration that occurs.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you. And did you want to ask you a question? Still on mute. Okay, mute's not working, so I'll ask that for you. So, and would love to know, what's the intensity of your rainfall events and how is that distributed across the year? So we heard of the monsoons, and then there's another question, which is, do you use rainwater tanks? Are they cost effective, and how does it compare to scheme?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so to the first question about the intensity of our rain and when it occurs, we have two significant rainy periods in the year. We get the summer monsoon, which are these super dramatic, wonderful, beautiful storms that Tucsonans love, which take place in the summer. It starts out, 43-degree days, not a cloud in the sky, and by the afternoon, these huge thunderheads have rolled in, and then it used to be you could set your clock by them, and at 3 o'clock, the sky would open up, dump rain for an hour, and then it would be over. And it was really a wonderful way of being able to cope with these extremely hot summers, knowing that this monsoon rain was coming, and it would take place really over the entire month of July, some into June, some into August. Those are becoming less and less reliable this year. And so we would typically get half of our rainfall in the monsoon, so like 150 mils. They've become strange. I think similar to here. It's just not what it used to be. You don't know when they're coming. They're increasingly severe. We had a crazy monsoon storm this year, where my family and I were driving, and this storm came out of nowhere and dumped hail. And literally everyone was getting off the road and taking shelter under any structure they could find. There are photographs of it that are just, it looks like a waterfall is coming down from the sky in the middle of the city. Really, really strange, a lot more intense. And then we get the winter rains, which are more subdued, longer, subtler, gentler rains. And so it's like the one big dramatic event in the summer, and then the more mellow dispersed rains in the winter. Oh shoot, the second part of your question was
about rainwater tanks and
yes.
How much do people pay for water?
So we have a lot of folks that put rainwater harvesting tanks, we call them cisterns, on their homes. As I mentioned, Tucson Water offers rebates for folks who add those to their homes at $1 a gallon of capacity. So that's cool. But they only use them in their landscape. So we don't actively collect water for use inside the home. Is that different from here? Do you all capture water and use it in the home?
You can do, yeah. So the most cost-effective way of using it is to plumb it back into your toilet. So that you're actually, because when it's raining, the gardens are getting watered.
Yes.
So and because we go so long without rainfall, it sort of is useless to use as an irrigation source unless you've got a massive tank, and you can hold it for a long period of time. So no, the best way is to plumb it back into a toilet.
Oh, that's super cool. No, we don't do that at all. I wish we did. We should. You all are much ahead of us in terms of these sort of like smaller fixed technologies. Like we don't even see like low water use toilets regularly. Like your toilets here are a beautiful thing, as far as toilets are concerned.
I love it.
So we only collect water off of our rooftops for use in our gardens. And so yeah, when people install cisterns, they install big ones. We're talking like 1,000 gallons, up to 3,000 gallons, or a row of smaller ones. And we use, I think they're invented here, Bushman tanks. The slimline ones are really, really popular. As far as the cost of water, it has been relatively really cheap for a very long time, and we are just beginning to see small increases in the rates for water, and a tiered system. So the more folks use, the more expensive it is.
Thank you. Now, I am recognising that it is 11 o'clock and there are a couple more questions left. What I might do, though, is just hang on to these questions because I do know that everybody will start leaving very soon. And I will get Blue to answer the questions and send you those answers if that's okay, unless there's one question that somebody desperately needs answered now. If so, you're going to have to put your hand up. Okay, awesome. All right. So what I just want to say is thank you so much to Blue for sharing all of your learnings and your journey with us, because it is so much easier to learn from somebody else than start it all by yourself. And of course, thank you, Blue, for acknowledging UWA and the partnership with the University of Arizona and some of the learnings coming out of that. We will start to share more through the New Waterways webinar series. So stay tuned on this channel. Everybody say thank you so much to Blue.